The dust had settled into his bones like a promise that would never be kept. James sat on the weathered porch of Millfield's only saloon, his fingers wrapped around a glass that had grown warm in the desert heat. 3 years he'd been waiting. 3 years since Marcus rode out of town with his money, his trust, and a piece of his soul that felt like it might never grow back. The boy appeared at the edge of town like a mirage, small and determined, leading a horse too big for his hands. But it was the eyes that stopped James's breath, his own eyes, staring back at him across 13 years of silence. The afternoon sun carved shadows across Millfield's main street, like scars on weathered leather. James had memorized every grain of dust that settled on his boots, every creak of the saloon's wooden steps beneath his weight. The whiskey in his glass caught the light and threw it back in amber fragments, each one a reminder of the money Marcus had stolen, the partnership that had crumbled like dried clay in his hands. He'd built his life around this moment of reckoning, around the certainty that someday the drifter would return to face what he'd done. The town moved around him in its lazy rhythm, Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch, old Pete leading his mule to the water trough, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against iron like a heartbeat that refused to stop. But James saw none of it, his attention fixed on the horizon where the road disappeared into heat shimmer and broken promises. The boy materialized from that shimmer like something conjured from his deepest fears. Small for his age, maybe 13, with clothes that had seen too many miles and boots that were more whole than leather. His horse was a gentle mare, too old and too patient for the journey they'd clearly made together. James felt his hand tighten around the glass as the boy approached, something familiar in the way he carried himself, something that made the whiskey taste like ash in his mouth. The child's face was sun-darkened and serious, marked by a determination that belonged to someone much older. When he stopped in front of the saloon and looked up, James felt the world tilt on its axis. Those eyes, green as bottle glass, with flecks of gold that caught the light, were his own eyes, staring back at him across a chasm of years he'd never known existed. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him dizzy with disbelief. He'd seen those eyes in every mirror, in every reflection, in the still water of every stream where he'd stopped to drink. But here they were in a face that was softer, younger, unmarked by the disappointments that had carved lines around his own. The boy's mouth was different, fuller, more generous, and his hair was lighter, touched with copper where James's had always been dark, but the eyes were unmistakable, and with them came a flood of memories he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. Sarah. Her name rose in his throat like a prayer he'd stopped believing in, bringing with it the ghost of her laughter, the memory of her hands in his hair, the way she'd looked at him the last time he'd seen her, 14 years ago in Santa Fe. The boy stood there in the dust, holding his horse's reins with hands that trembled slightly, and James realized he was waiting for something, recognition, acknowledgement, perhaps just the simple courtesy of being seen. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap under the weight of all the words that couldn't be spoken. James wanted to stand, to move, to do something other than sit there like a man turned to stone, but his body wouldn't obey. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden planks, the sound sharp and final in the desert air. The boy flinched but didn't step back, and in that small act of courage, James saw something else he recognized, the stubborn pride that had driven him to wait 3 years for a man who might never come, the same pride that had cost him everything he'd ever loved. Around them, the town continued its sleepy dance, oblivious to the earthquake that had just reshaped James's world. Mrs. Henderson paused in her sweeping to glance their way, her curiosity mild and passing. The blacksmith's hammer kept its steady rhythm, marking time in a world that had suddenly become foreign and strange. James felt as though he was watching everything through glass, separated from the familiar, by this impossible truth that stood before him in dusty clothes and worn boots. The boy was real, solid, undeniably present, and with his presence came questions that James wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Where had he come from? How had he found this place? And most terrifying of all, what did he want from a father who had never known he existed? The afternoon light was beginning to slant toward evening, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the boy's hair glow like a halo. James finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uncertain, like a man speaking after years of silence. "Boy," he said, and the word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the weight of recognition and fear and desperate hope that he couldn't quite bring himself to name. The child's eyes never left his face, and in their depths, James saw not just his own reflection, but the echo of a love he'd thought was lost forever, and the promise of a future he'd never dared to imagine. The boy's voice, when it finally came, was steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Are you James Whitmore?" The question cut through the evening air like a blade, precise and unavoidable. James nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady, and watched as something shifted in the child's expression, relief mixed with apprehension, hope tempered by years of uncertainty. The boy reached into his saddlebag with careful deliberation, his movements slow and purposeful, as though he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. What he pulled out was a letter, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges from handling. The paper trembled in his small hands as he held it out, and James could see his own name written across the front in handwriting he'd recognize anywhere, even after all these years. Sarah's letter felt like holding fire in his hands. The paper was soft as cloth, creased from folding and unfolding, and it smelled faintly of lavender and dust and time. James's fingers traced the familiar loops and curves of her writing, remembering the way she'd bite her lower lip when she concentrated, the way her hand would move across the page with such careful precision. He didn't need to open it to know what it would say. The truth was standing right in front of him, patient and real and impossible to deny. But his hands moved of their own accord, breaking the seal that had held her words captive for 13 years. The letter was brief, written in the careful script he remembered, telling him about Ethan, about the choice she'd made to raise him alone, about her death 2 months ago, and her final wish that the boy should know his father. Ethan. The name settled into James's consciousness like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew about his life. The boy, his son, stood watching him read, his green eyes never wavering from James's face, as though he could read the emotions that played across it like shadows on a wall. There was patience in his stance, the kind of patience that came from years of waiting, of wondering, of building up courage for this single moment. James folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking now despite his efforts to remain steady. The paper felt precious and fragile, like something that might crumble if he held it too tightly, taking with it the last connection to a woman he'd loved and lost and never forgotten. The silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier, more charged with possibility and fear. James looked at his son and saw Sarah in the curve of his mouth, in the way he held his head when he was thinking, in the stubborn set of his jaw that spoke of decisions made and unmade and made again. But he saw himself, too, in ways that went beyond the obvious mirror of their eyes. There was something in Ethan's stillness that reminded him of his own way of watching the world, of taking its measure before deciding how to respond. The boy had traveled alone to find him, had crossed desert and mountain and prairie with nothing but a letter and a hope, and that kind of determination was something James understood in his bones. The town around them had begun to settle into evening, the last of the day's heat rising from the dusty street in visible waves. Lanterns were being lit in windows, casting warm yellow rectangles of light that made the gathering darkness seem deeper by contrast. James realized that people were beginning to notice them. Mrs. Henderson had stopped pretending to sweep and was watching openly now, and he could see faces in the saloon windows. curious and speculative. The story would be all over town by morning, he knew, the tale of the cowboy who'd waited 3 years for a drifter and instead found a son. But for now, in this moment suspended between day and night, between past and future, there was only the two of them and the weight of 13 years of separation. Ethan shifted slightly, his horse nickering softly behind him, and James realized the boy was waiting for him to speak, to acknowledge what the letter had revealed, to say something that would bridge the impossible gap between stranger and father. But what words could possibly be adequate for such a moment? How did a man apologize for 13 years of absence he'd never known existed? How did he explain that he'd loved the boy's mother with everything he had? But that love hadn't been enough to keep her from leaving, from choosing a life that didn't include him. The questions multiplied in his mind like echoes in a canyon, each one leading to another, until he felt lost in the labyrinth of his own uncertainty. Finally, because silence was its own kind of cruelty, James stood up from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. The movement brought him closer to Ethan, close enough to see the exhaustion in the boy's face, the way his shoulders sagged with the weight of his journey and his hope. "You must be tired," James said, and the words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what was happening between them. But Ethan's face brightened slightly, as though even this simple acknowledgement was more than he'd dared to hope for, and James felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been locked for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The boy's hands trembled as he lifted the tin cup to his lips, and James watched the way Ethan's throat worked when he swallowed. The same careful deliberation James remembered in his own father when the old man was trying not to show weakness. The saloon had emptied, except for the bartender who wiped glasses with mechanical precision, his eyes carefully averted from the strange tableau of the gunslinger and the child who shared his stubborn jawline. James felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip, but for the first time in years, the gun felt like an anchor rather than salvation, dragging him down into waters he didn't know how to navigate. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the years between them, and James found himself studying the boy's profile, searching for traces of the woman who had vanished from his life like smoke from a dying fire. Ethan set down the cup with the same careful precision James used when handling his weapons, and the similarity made something twist in James's gut. Not pain, exactly, but recognition of a kinship he'd never expected to claim. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, and James could feel the weight of unspoken questions pressing against his ribs. He'd spent 13 years imagining what he might say to Marcus when the drifter finally showed his face, had rehearsed the words until they felt like bullets in his mouth. But now all those carefully planned accusations seemed to crumble into dust. The boy's presence had shifted something fundamental in the landscape of his anger, like a landslide that changes the course of a river, and James found himself adrift in territory he'd never mapped. Ethan's eyes, his own eyes, reflected back at him across the scarred wooden table, held a wariness that spoke of too many disappointments, too many promises broken by adults who should have known better. The bartender's cloth squeaked against glass in a rhythm that matched James's heartbeat, and he realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he was afraid, not of dying, but of failing someone who needed him. The boy shifted in his chair, and James caught a glimpse of a faded bruise on Ethan's wrist, yellow-green like old sorrow, and felt his hands clench into fists beneath the table. "Your mother," James began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat like barbed wire. Ethan's head snapped up, and James saw hope flicker across the boy's features before being quickly shuttered behind that careful mask of indifference. The afternoon was dying outside, painting the saloon in shades of amber and regret, and James felt the weight of 13 lost years settling on his shoulders like dust from a long journey. He'd carried Sarah's memory like a wound that wouldn't heal, had let it fester into something dark and poisonous. But looking at this boy, his son, he wondered if he'd been mourning the wrong ghost all along. The bartender cleared his throat and retreated to the far end of the bar, leaving them alone with their shared silence and the ghosts that danced between them. Ethan's fingers traced patterns on the table's surface, and James recognized the gesture as his own nervous habit, the way he'd drum his fingers against his holster when he was thinking too hard about things that couldn't be changed. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, and he had to look away, focusing on the dust motes that swirled in the dying light like tiny spirits seeking rest. "She used to sing," Ethan said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, and James felt his breath catch in his chest. The boy's words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they could cross, and James found himself leaning forward despite every instinct that told him to retreat. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, soft and sweet as honey, the way she'd hum while she worked in the garden behind their little house, and he wondered what songs she'd sung to their son in the years after she'd disappeared from his life. The saloon seemed to hold its breath around them, as though even the building itself understood the fragility of this moment, and James felt something shift in his chest, not healing exactly, but the first tentative movement toward it. Ethan's eyes were fixed on his hands, but James could see the tension in the boy's shoulders, the way he held himself ready to flee at the first sign of rejection. The late afternoon sun painted everything in gold and shadow, and James thought about all the sunsets he'd watched alone, all the evenings he'd spent nursing his anger like a dying fire, never knowing that somewhere in the world his son was watching the same sky and wondering about the father he'd never known. The boy's next words came out in a rush, as though he'd been holding them back for years and could no longer contain them. "She said you were a good man who'd lost his way, that sometimes people get so hurt they forget how to find their way back home." James felt those words hit him like bullets, each one finding its mark in the places where he'd armored himself against hope, and he had to grip the edge of the table to keep his hands from shaking. The bartender had disappeared entirely now, leaving them alone with the weight of revelation and the ghosts of might-have-beens, and James wondered if this was what redemption felt like, not the clean satisfaction of revenge, but this messy, complicated tangle of love and regret and possibility. Ethan looked up then, and James saw his own desperate hope reflected in the boy's eyes, saw the child's need for a father warring with the hard-earned wisdom that told him not to trust too easily. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not empty, but full of potential, like the moment before a storm breaks and washes the world clean. James reached across the table, his calloused hand covering Ethan's smaller one, and felt the boy's fingers curl around his like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The touch broke something open in James that he'd thought was sealed forever, and he felt tears he hadn't shed since Sarah's funeral burning behind his eyes. The boy didn't pull away, and James marveled at the trust implicit in that simple gesture, the way Ethan's hand fit perfectly in his own, as though they'd been designed to hold each other. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the saloon's windows and carrying with it the scent of rain and new beginnings, and James thought about the long road that had brought them both to this moment. His years of bitter wandering, the boy's journey across dangerous territory to find a father who might not want him. The late afternoon light was fading now, painting the world in shades of purple and gold, and James realized that for the first time in 13 years, he wasn't thinking about Marcus or revenge or the weight of his gun against his hip. Instead, he was thinking about tomorrow, about the possibility of teaching this boy to ride and shoot and navigate the harsh beauty of the desert, about the chance to be the father he'd never had the opportunity to become. The moment stretched between them like a prayer, fragile and precious and full of hope, and James knew that whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same. The hotel room smelled of dust and old dreams, and James watched Ethan sleep in the narrow bed by the window, the boy's face peaceful in a way that made James's chest ache with unfamiliar tenderness. The moonlight painted silver patterns across the worn floorboards, and James sat in the chair by the door, his gun belt hanging on the bedpost like a discarded skin from a life he was no longer sure he wanted to claim. Every few minutes, he found himself checking the boy's breathing, the rise and fall of Ethan's chest beneath the thin blanket, a rhythm that seemed to anchor James to something he'd thought he'd lost forever. The night was full of sounds. The distant howl of coyotes, the creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. But for the first time in years, James didn't hear them as threats. Instead, they seemed like a lullaby, the desert's way of singing his son to sleep, and he marveled at how quickly his priorities had shifted, how the boy's presence had rearranged the landscape of his heart. The wanted poster for Marcus still crinkled in his vest pocket, but it felt like a relic from another life, a reminder of the man he'd been before he learned he was a father. The boy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something James couldn't quite catch, and he found himself leaning forward, straining to hear words that might have been his name or might have been nothing more than the random sounds of dreams. Ethan's hair fell across his forehead in the same stubborn cowlick James remembered fighting with every morning as a child, and the similarity made him smile despite the weight of uncertainty that pressed against his ribs. Tomorrow would bring decisions he wasn't ready to make. What to do about Marcus, where to take the boy, how to build a life from the wreckage of his past. But tonight, it was enough to sit in this chair and watch over the son he'd never known he had. The hotel's thin walls carried the sounds of other lives, a woman's laughter from the room next door, the heavy footsteps of someone pacing overhead, the distant murmur of conversation from the saloon below. And James thought about all the nights he'd spent alone in rooms like this, nursing his anger and planning his revenge. The contrast between then and now was so sharp it made him dizzy, as though he'd been living underwater for years and had suddenly broken the surface to find the world transformed. Ethan shifted again, and his hand fell open on the pillow, palm up like a question James wasn't sure he knew how to answer. The sound of boots on the stairs made James's hand move instinctively toward his gun, but he stopped himself, remembering the sleeping boy and the fragile peace that filled the room like morning light. The footsteps passed their door and continued down the hall, and James felt his shoulders relax, though part of him remained alert to the possibility of danger. He'd spent so many years living on the edge of violence that it felt strange to consider laying down his weapons, to think about a future that didn't revolve around the next gunfight or the next town where someone might recognize his face. The boy's presence had changed the equation in ways James was still trying to understand, had introduced variables he'd never had to consider when his only responsibility was to himself and his ghosts. Ethan's breathing deepened, and James found himself matching the rhythm, his own chest rising and falling in sync with his son's, as though they were learning to breathe together after years of holding their breath. The night stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and uncertainty, and James thought about the stories he might tell the boy about his mother, about the life they might have had if things had been different. A coyote's howl drifted through the window, long and mournful, and James remembered the nights he'd spent under the stars, tracking Marcus across the endless desert, driven by a need for vengeance that had consumed him like a fever. The sound no longer filled him with restless energy, no longer made him want to saddle his horse and ride into the darkness in pursuit of ghosts. Instead, it seemed like a farewell, the desert's way of releasing him from the bonds of his past, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Ethan mumbled in his sleep again, and this time James caught the word "papa," spoken so softly it might have been the wind, but it hit him like a physical blow nonetheless. The boy had never known him, had traveled hundreds of miles on nothing more than hope and a faded photograph, and yet somehow he'd found the faith to call James father, even in his dreams. The trust implicit in that single word was both humbling and terrifying, and James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy to wear. The moonlight shifted, casting new shadows across the room, and James thought about the man he'd been and the man he might become, about the choice that lay before him like a crossroads in the desert. The boy's hand twitched in his sleep, and James found himself reaching out, his calloused fingers brushing against Ethan's knuckles in a touch so gentle it surprised him. The contact sent a jolt through his system, not of electricity but of connection, of belonging, and he marveled at how something so simple could feel so profound. He'd touched his gun 1,000 times, had felt the familiar weight of metal and wood in his palm, but this was different. This was life, warm and fragile and infinitely precious. Ethan's fingers curled slightly at the touch, and James held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell that seemed to have settled over them like a blessing. The night was deep now, the kind of darkness that comes just before dawn, and James thought about the sunrise that would soon paint the eastern sky, about the new day that would bring new choices and new possibilities. For the first time in 13 years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, not because it might bring him closer to his revenge, but because it would give him another day with his son. The realization hit him like a revelation, and he felt tears he'd thought were long dried up burning behind his eyes, salt and sorrow, and something that might have been joy, all mixed together in a cocktail of emotion he didn't know how to name. The sound of his own heartbeat seemed loud in the quiet room, and James wondered if this was what peace felt like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something worth protecting. Ethan's breathing remained steady and deep, the sleep of a child who had finally found safety after a long and dangerous journey, and James felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest like a tide. He thought about Marcus, about the debt that had driven him across half the territory, about the gun that hung on the bedpost like a reminder of the man he used to be. The weight of decision pressed against him, but for now it was enough to sit in this chair and watch over his sleeping son, to guard this fragile moment against the harsh realities that would intrude with the morning light. The coyotes had fallen silent, and the desert held its breath around them, as though even the wilderness understood the sanctity of this space. This time, this unexpected gift of fatherhood that had fallen into James's life like rain in a drought. He closed his eyes and listened to the boy breathe, and for the first time in years, James allowed himself to hope. Dawn crept through the hotel window like a thief, stealing the shadows that had hidden James's tears through the long night, and he watched Ethan wake with the slow, careful movements of a child who had learned not to trust the world too quickly. The boy's eyes found James immediately, and the relief that flickered across his features was so profound it made James's throat tighten with emotion he couldn't name. They dressed in silence, the weight of unspoken decisions hanging between them like morning mist, and James found himself moving with unusual care, as though any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile trust they'd built in the darkness. The hotel's floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they made their way downstairs, and James noticed how Ethan stayed close to his side, not clinging but present, like a shadow that had finally found its source of light. The dining room smelled of coffee and bacon, ordinary scents that seemed extraordinary in the context of this new reality, and James marveled at how the simple act of ordering breakfast for two could feel like stepping into a different life entirely. The waitress smiled at Ethan with the automatic kindness that some women showed to children, and James felt a stab of something that might have been pride, watching his son navigate the interaction with polite reserve. The coffee was bitter and strong, and James wrapped his hands around the cup to hide their trembling, watching Ethan attack his eggs with the focused hunger of someone who hadn't eaten well in days. The boy's table manners were careful and precise, another reminder of Sarah's influence, and James found himself wondering what other lessons she'd taught their son in the years they'd been apart. The dining room filled slowly with the usual collection of travelers and locals, their conversations creating a backdrop of normalcy that felt both comforting and surreal, and James caught himself scanning faces out of habit, looking for threats that might not even exist anymore. Ethan glanced up from his plate, and James saw his own wariness reflected in the boy's eyes, the shared understanding that safety was always temporary, always conditional. The morning light streaming through the windows painted everything in shades of gold and possibility, but James could feel the weight of his gun against his hip, the familiar pressure that had been his constant companion for so many years. The wanted poster in his vest pocket seemed to burn against his chest, and he thought about Marcus, about the debt that had driven him across the territory, about the choice that lay before him like a fork in a desert road. "Where will we go?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation, and James felt the question hit him like a physical blow. The boy's eyes held a mixture of hope and fear, the look of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust easily, but who couldn't quite give up on the possibility of belonging somewhere. James set down his coffee cup with hands that shook slightly, and he realized that for the first time in 13 years, he didn't have an answer ready, didn't have a plan that extended beyond the next gunfight or the next town where someone might have seen Marcus's face. The boy was waiting for him to be a father, to provide the kind of stability and security that James had never known how to give, and the weight of that expectation was both terrifying and exhilarating. The dining room continued its morning rhythm around them, but James felt as though they were suspended in a bubble of silence, a space where the future hung in the balance, and every word carried the weight of destiny. Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and James saw the boy's careful composure beginning to crack, revealing the child beneath the mask of premature maturity. "I don't know," James admitted, and the honesty felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. Ethan's face fell slightly, but there was something else there too, relief perhaps at hearing truth instead of empty promises. The morning sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across their table, and James thought about all the mornings he'd spent alone, planning his next move in the endless chess game of pursuit and evasion. The boy deserved better than a life lived on the run, deserved the kind of childhood that James had never had. But the past clung to him like desert dust, impossible to shake completely clean. The sound of horses in the street outside made both of them look toward the window, and James felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun before he caught himself, remembering that not every sound was a threat, not every stranger was an enemy. Ethan noticed the gesture, and James saw understanding flicker in the boy's eyes, the recognition that his father was a man who lived with violence as a constant companion. The knowledge seemed to age the boy before James's eyes, and he felt a stab of regret for the innocence that his presence had already begun to steal. The waitress refilled their coffee cups with practiced efficiency, and James found himself studying her movements, the way she navigated between tables with the confidence of someone who knew her place in the world. He envied her that certainty, that sense of belonging to something larger than herself, and he wondered if it was too late for him to find that kind of peace. Ethan pushed his eggs around his plate, and James could see the boy's mind working, processing the implications of his father's uncertainty, trying to reconcile the man he'd imagined with the reality sitting across from him. The dining room was warming up now, filled with the comfortable sounds of a community going about its morning business, and James felt like an outsider looking in, a ghost haunting the edges of normal life. The boy's next words came out in a whisper, so soft James had to lean forward to hear them. "Mama said you were looking for someone who hurt you." The statement hung between them like a confession, and James felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, revealing the raw wound that had driven him for so many years. Ethan's eyes were fixed on his plate, but James could see the tension in the boy's shoulders, the way he held himself ready for rejection or anger or whatever other adult emotions might come flooding out. "She was right," James said finally, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for too long. The admission felt like bleeding, like opening a vein and watching his life pour out onto the scarred wooden table. But there was relief in it too, the strange comfort that comes from finally speaking a truth that has been eating you alive from the inside. Ethan looked up then, and James saw his own pain reflected in the boy's eyes, saw the child's instinctive understanding of hurt and loss, and the need for justice. The morning light painted them both in shades of gold and shadow, and James thought about the stories he might tell his son about the past, about the choices that had led them both to this moment in this place. The dining room continued its gentle chaos around them, but James felt as though they were the only two people in the world, connected by blood and sorrow and the fragile possibility of redemption. The weight of his gun seemed heavier now, not because it had changed, but because he had. Because the presence of this boy had shifted the entire landscape of his priorities. The choice lay before him like a crossroads in the desert, and James knew that whatever path he chose would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the son who had found him when he thought he was beyond finding.